In the wind-bitten hills of Dunbray, a village carved into the bones of old Scotland, the passage of time was marked not by calendars or church bells, but by the hands of the Drummond clocks. Every home, from the butcher's cottage to the manor's study, held a piece of the Drummond legacy. Quiet, handcrafted marvels that ticked in perfect rhythm with each other, binding the villagers to a shared heartbeat. The Drummonds had been clockmakers for generations, known not just for precision but for artistry. Locals said their clocks never lost time, not by a second, even in death. When the last patriarch, Thomas Drummond, passed in the winter of 1922, the village grieved, not just for the man, but for the stillness they feared might follow. Yet when Edward Drummond, his only son, returned from Edinburgh to claim the estate, there was a collective sigh of relief. Edward was polite, educated, soft-spoken, thin and pale, with hands like silk gloves stretched over piano wire. He smiled easily, but not often. He walked with a deliberate rhythm, as though each step had been rehearsed. He resumed the family trade, locking himself into the clock tower workshop at the edge of the estate. Smoke rose from its chimney every morning. Deliveries were made, repairs were collected, but no one ever saw him work. Then, on the morning of March 14th, the ticking stopped, all of it. The shop clocks, the tower bell, the pendulums in the homes. They didn't break, they simply froze, every hand resting in a different position, as if time had been interrupted mid-breath. The villagers waited, confused. Some knocked at the estate gates. No answer. Some believed it was a mechanical failure, a rare lapse. Others whispered it was grief catching up with Edward. But days passed, and not a single mechanism resumed its rhythm. No smoke rose from the chimney, no clocks were returned. Then weeks. The silence grew unnatural, like a vacuum in the center of their world. Time was no longer kept. It loitered. Something had shifted, something buried beneath years of trust and the illusion of normalcy. The Drummond house sat quiet, windows shuttered as if holding its breath. No one knew it then, but the silence had marked the beginning of something else. Something carefully planned, decades in the making, and wrapped in the thin, smiling mask of Edward Drummond. In the summer of 1973, the Drummond estate had become more ruin than home. Its windows shattered by weather, its floors warped by decades of damp silence. A construction crew had been hired to prepare the manor for historical preservation, though no one truly remembered what made it worth saving. The village of Dunbray had grown quiet over the years, like a place that had been trying to forget itself. But that forgetting ended when one of the workers, a man named Callum Fraser, pulled up the floorboards in the West Wing's drawing room and uncovered something that stopped every breath in the house. It was a child, or what was left of one. The skeleton had been hidden with care, curled in on itself like it had once tried to disappear. The wrists were still bound behind its back with rusted wire, twisted so tightly the bone had grown warped beneath it. The skull bore no trauma, but the jaw was forced shut unnaturally. Copper threads looped through the teeth and pulled through the flesh that was no longer there. Someone had sewn the mouth closed, not in haste, but with patience. One of the men vomited. Another sat down and cried. Police were called. Reporters followed. The estate was sealed overnight, and within 24 hours, a quiet man in a charcoal coat stepped through the gates. Inspector Wallace Murray had seen bodies before. He had worked the docks, the slums, the riverbeds. But this was different. This wasn't a killing. This was a message someone never meant to be read. As he moved through the house, he noticed strange things. Symmetrical scratch marks behind closet panels, nails driven into doors that had no hinges, soot-stained ceilings without fireplaces. And then the journals began to surface, not in plain view but wedged behind walls, hidden beneath broken drawers. slipped between pages of forgotten books. Most were written in symbols, strange diagrams and timekeeping terms that made no sense without context. But one thing was clear. This house had kept secrets far longer than anyone suspected. The boy beneath the floorboards was not an accident. He was a chapter in a story that had been carefully hidden behind manners, behind reputation, behind time itself. And Wallace knew from the first moment he saw the copper thread that this was only the beginning. Inspector Wallace Murray sat alone in the candlelit study of the Drummond estate. A stack of mold-eaten journals beside him, each filled with a language no one had spoken, yet Edward Drummond had written fluently. The ink had faded, but the strokes were perfect. Small notations written with a clockmaker's patience. Not words at first glance, but symbols. Overlapping gears, broken pendulum diagrams, compass roses fused with anatomical sketches. Wallace felt like he was reading the thoughts of someone who hadn't simply lost their mind, but someone who had built a new one. A codebreaker from Edinburgh had been brought in, and over weeks the language slowly gave way to meaning. What emerged was not a confession. It was a blueprint. Edward had not seen people as people. He had seen them as mechanisms. Flawed, clumsy devices designed without precision. He believed that time ruled not just the body, but the soul. Every breath, every act of emotion, every sin was a result of poor calibration. He wrote that pain was not punishment. It was an adjustment. The entries were clinical, emotionless, and horrifying in their calm logic. In one, he wrote that a boy had a malfunctioning rhythm. He cried at night, disrupted others, and could not sleep. Edward had placed him in a chamber of controlled sound, forcing him to endure ticking at irregular speeds for days. The boy's pulse eventually matched the new rhythm. Edward described it as successful synchronization. In another entry, he detailed how he starved a child for 9 days, only feeding him when he moved in perfect unison with the hands of a clock Edward had mounted above his cot. When the child hesitated or twitched off tempo, the food was removed. Eventually, he no longer looked at the food. He watched the clock. Edward called this devotion to external rhythm. He spoke not with hatred, not with pleasure, but with fascination, the way a surgeon describes muscle or a machinist discusses friction. To him, disobedience was not moral failure. It was mechanical failure. One journal was titled Organic Synchronization, Trials 4-8. Wallace read it in silence. It spoke of children as if they were instruments being tuned. Some had rejected the procedure. Their organs couldn't handle the stress. He'd written that stopping their hearts was not cruelty, but mercy, like discarding a shattered spring. He drew diagrams of their ribs and labeled them as chimes. In the margins, he scribbled equations attempting to align emotional response to time signatures. He believed the body could be retrained to experience grief, fear, even loyalty, based on a precisely applied rhythm of pain and reward. There were no names, only numbers. Subject 6. Subject 9. Subject 12. He claimed the most progress with younger children as their inner time maps were still soft, still malleable. One sentence was underlined in red. The youngest resists the least. Their ticking still waits for guidance. Wallace closed the journal with shaking hands. This was no longer about a murder. It was not even about madness. It was about something colder. A belief system built in isolation, shaped by silence and hidden behind a smile. Edward Drummond had not acted from impulse. He had operated from design. And now, Wallace understood. The silence in the village, the stopped clocks, the vanished children, they weren't separate horrors, they were gears in the same machine. Wallace lit another candle. The room felt tighter now, like something unseen was watching, waiting, timing his breath. Because once you start to see the world the way Edward Drummond did, it doesn't let go. It ticks. Quietly. Forever. The west wing of the Drummond estate had always been off limits. Even during the estate's prime, no servants were allowed past the third corridor. The doors were locked from the inside with no key ever found. For 50 years, no one had stepped beyond the wall of rotting oak and dust-covered velvet drapes. Until now. Inspector Wallace stood in silence as the old door gave way with a slow, aching groan, revealing a staircase that curved downward into dark stone. The air was cold, metallic, and thick with something that did not belong in the world above. What they found was not a room, but a stage. A sealed chamber beneath the house lined with tarnished mirrors and thick sheets of warped lead hammered into the walls. There were no windows, no light but from the lamps the investigators carried, and yet everything inside had been preserved. It had not been abandoned. It had been hidden. In the center of the room sat a long wooden table, flanked by mannequins in dinner suits and children's dresses, seated like guests at a banquet frozen in time. Their heads were porcelain, hand-painted, but their mouths were filled with real human teeth, filed, arranged, and numbered in small wax tags. Some jaws were wired open, others shut, locked in what looked like screams or prayer. The table was bare except for a set of surgical tools laid out in a perfect arc, each resting on black velvet and etched with strange markings. Wallace looked closer and noticed something disturbing. Each tool was tagged with a date, not by year or month, but by moon phase. New moon. Waxing crescent. Full. Waning gibbous. It was a calendar made from flesh and ritual. Beside the table stood a tall grandfather clock, cracked open at the back, exposing gears rusted with what the forensics team later confirmed was blood. Its pendulum was missing, replaced by a dried length of intestine that still swayed slightly when the door was moved. Edward had used this room for something more than punishment. This was not where he adjusted his victim. This was where he presented them, where he tested their silence under ritual conditions. His journals, recovered from a hidden drawer beneath the floor, described this chamber as the hollow room. He believed it was a space unbound by time, a place where the soul could be emptied and reprogrammed. One entry spoke of the mirror walls as refractors of disobedience, designed to reflect the subject's own fear until their instincts collapsed. He claimed they created a loop, an echo of suffering that lasted longer than anybody could withstand. Another entry called the dinner setup the gathering of restored silence. Edward had not killed to erase lives. He had killed to erase patterns, to remove what he called corruptive rhythms from the human form. The placement of the tools according to lunar shifts suggested that he believed obedience was tied to natural cycles, that pain delivered under specific celestial alignments was more effective, that it lasted longer. This was not medical. It was not even mechanical. It was something older, more primitive, buried in a shell of science to make it digestible to his own twisted mind. Wallace didn't speak for a long time. No one did. One investigator stared at the mannequins for nearly 10 minutes, then asked to be transferred. Another never returned to duty. The hollow room was sealed again, but not for preservation, for protection, because inside those walls was a truth too heavy for most to carry. And for Wallace, this was no longer an investigation. It was a descent, and deeper still, something was waiting. Something that didn't just understand cruelty. It had organized it, timed it, rehearsed it. And it wasn't finished. The deeper Inspector Wallace dug, the more the silence around Edward Drummond began to feel not like absence, but orchestration. It was in the town records, the church bulletins, even the newspaper clippings. Edward had been admired, quietly but widely, for what they called his generosity. From 1924 to 1937, he had taken in 14 orphan boys from different towns across Scotland. The requests had been legal, signed through proper channels, often framed as charitable gestures. No one had ever questioned why he never adopted girls. No one had thought to ask what happened after the boys arrived at the estate, because no one had seen them again. Not in school, not in town, not at church. Their names vanished from public record the moment they crossed the Drummond gate. Yet no alarm was raised, because Edward smiled, because Edward shook hands, because Edward wrote thank you letters in beautiful penmanship to orphanage directors. He was the lonely craftsman restoring hope after his father's death, offering stability and trade to poor boys with no homes. Wallace stood inside the local records office, reading line after line of acceptance papers, each stamped and dated, each written in the same precise ink, the same sterile words. To be educated in the horological arts. But there were no certificates, no former apprentices, no sign of trade passed on. Just vanished names, ages, and grainy photographs that seemed to grow heavier the longer one stared at them. One boy had written a short letter weeks after his arrival, thanking the orphanage matron and saying the estate was very quiet, very clean. That was the last trace of him. Wallace learned that neighbors assumed the boys had returned to their birth cities or been sent away for schooling. No one had dared ask Edward directly. He was private, they said. Brilliant, kind in his way. But private. That was the horror of it. Not that Edward had done what he did in secret, but that he had done it in the open, in plain sight of a society trained not to see what didn't look like a threat. He didn't hide in the shadows. He invited children in through the front door. He made tea. He answered the door himself and wore the same wool vest each Sunday. But behind that quiet face was a mind that had reduced children to mechanisms before he ever met them. Wallace wrote the names on a single sheet of paper. Thomas, Eli, James, Daniel, Matthew, 14 in total. He stared at the list and realized it looked like something else entirely, like parts inventory. Each name is a component, each boy has a test. And all of them, one by one, disappeared into a house that had no clocks, no noise, and no shame. The journals found in the lead-lined drawer beneath Edward Drummond's desk had no covers, no titles, and no page numbers. Just rows of entries written in a thin, unbroken hand. Each marked with a subject number, a date, and a short, cold note on progress. Wallace called them the calibration diaries. To Edward, the boys he brought into his home were not sons. They were not people. They were experiments in rhythm. Moving, breathing tools whose emotions, fears, and instincts could be dismantled like the springs of a broken watch. He had erased their names and replaced them with numbers. Subject 5, Subject 9, Subject 12. He did not write about who they were. He wrote about how they responded. Subject 5 had wept every night for his first 3 days. Edward recorded the length of each crying episode with a stopwatch, noting the fluctuations in pitch, frequency, and breath intervals. On day 4, the child was placed in a locked cabinet for 6 hours. Complete darkness, surrounded by irregular chimes of metal scraping stone. When he emerged, he no longer cried. Edward called this a partial reset. Subject 9 was left-handed. Edward believed this was a sign of asymmetrical rhythm, a flaw in natural calibration. The boy's left arm was bound to his side with straps for 9 weeks. He was forced to complete mechanical tasks using only his right hand. When he failed, food was withheld. When he succeeded, the clocks in his room would chime, not to reward him, but to reinforce what Edward called corrective resonance. Eventually, the boy's left hand curled into permanent disuse. Edward logged this as successful rewiring of dominant rhythm. Another entry described Subject 7's sleep being interrupted every hour by a piercing tone that only stopped when the child returned to a seated prayer-like posture. After a month, the boy's body learned to wake 5 minutes before the tone. Not from fear, but anticipation. Edward wrote, "Subject now conforms to pre-signal behavior, excellent yield, no resistance." None of the deaths were accidents, they were tests, boundaries being pushed, reactions measured. One boy, possibly Subject 11, had been fed on a strict clock of 6-hour cycles. A single deviation caused Edward to extend the next fast to 30 hours. The boy eventually refused to eat at all, unable to trust the rhythm. Edward recorded this as a failure in the subject's soul coil. He wrote that some designs could not be fixed, only replaced. Each page was more horrifying than the last, not because of the pain they described, but because of the calm behind them. Edward was not angry. He was not sadistic in the usual way. He was a man who believed he was improving something broken, that the soul, if it existed, was just another mechanism that needed tuning. Wallace stared at the final page, where a single sentence was written over and over as though testing its truth. Emotion is excess movement. Stillness is perfection. Wallace turned the page. It was blank, but the silence in the room wasn't. Something deeper had begun ticking. It was a second team that found the clock, tucked behind a boarded hallway that hadn't been opened in nearly 70 years. The boards had been nailed from the inside. At first glance, it was just another timepiece, like hundreds of others in the Drummond estate. 7 feet tall, carved mahogany, dust settled thick in every crease. But when they tried to move it, the floor beneath groaned strangely, like the weight inside was shifting. One man forced the door open, expecting gears, expecting dust and metal. What they saw instead was something that no one spoke of directly in the report. Not at first, because it didn't seem possible. Inside the clock, stretched vertically with deliberate cruelty, was the body of a child, or what remained of him. The bones had been rearranged. The vertebrae had been extended with pins and wires, separating each disc by small metal washers. The spinal column had been fixed to the top of the clock case, hanging like a pendulum. At its base, soft tissue, still clinging, somehow preserved, was weighted with a small brass sphere. The body swayed, barely, but it swayed. Wallace arrived 20 minutes later, white gloves on, face pale but focused. Forensics whispered about environmental vacuuming, about chemical drying agents, but even they didn't understand how it had been kept intact. The boy's eyes had been removed, not torn out, removed surgically. The sockets are packed with cotton. His teeth had been painted in silver leaf. His arms were gone, amputated at the shoulders. His legs had been bound upward, folded and pinned like clock springs behind the rib cage. Wallace said nothing. He simply stared. On the inner panel of the clock casing, Edward had etched a phrase carved deep into the wood. Perfect arc. Perfect stillness. One of the recovered diaries helped fill the rest. Subject 13 had shown what Edward called exceptional pulse alignment. The child's resting heart rate had apparently matched Edward's model of temporal perfection. But the boy was also disobedient, not through rebellion, but delay. His movements were just a half-second behind command, a flaw, a stutter in rhythm. Edward could not tolerate it. He wrote that the child needed to be suspended beyond time. The pendulum wasn't symbolic, it was functional. The boy was reformed into a new mechanism, no longer a person but a moving part. The entire clock had been rebuilt around him, not as punishment but preservation. Edward had written, "Let him swing. Let him measure silence. Let his rhythm outlive mine." The image of it stayed with Wallace longer than anything else, not the bones, not the flesh, but the movement. That slow, mechanical sway that hadn't stopped in decades. The child had been turned into time itself, a cruel, motionless heartbeat ticking beneath the floorboards of a forgotten house. A legacy written not in blood, but in exactitude. Because Edward Drummond did not believe in death, he believed in function. And for Subject 13, that function was never allowed to end. The chamber was discovered deep beneath the lowest level of the Drummond estate, past the wine cellar and through a narrow crawlspace lined in copper. It was not listed in any blueprint. No doors led to it from inside the house. The team that uncovered it only did so because of a whisper in one of Edward's final journals. A line that read, "The rhythm must be trained below the ground, where light cannot interfere." What they found behind the hidden panel wasn't a room. It was a ritual site, and at the center of it stood a machine unlike anything they had ever seen. The walls of the chamber were completely sealed in copper sheets, their surface scratched with tally marks and etched circles like lunar calendars. The air was thick with an oily smell, the floor perfectly level. At the center was a tall chair, black iron, bolted to the ground with 5 restraints. Wrists, ankles, chest, and forehead. Wires extended from the armrests like vines trailing into the walls and converging into a box mounted high above the chair, ticking with a steady rhythm. The room did not echo. Sound died as soon as it left the mouth. Edward called it the hour of obedience. In his own words, it was the final proof that the spirit obeys rhythm before reason. According to the entry, the machine was calibrated to monitor a subject's heartbeat in real time. The chest strap measured pulse while the box above played a steady metronome, an audible tick every 2 seconds, precise and unchanging. The subject was required to listen, to internalize the pattern, and to match it with their own heart rate. If their pulse quickened even slightly, the punishment began. At first, the room would darken. A high-pitched tone would pulse in the walls, irregular and sharp, targeting the senses with waves of nausea and panic. If that failed, the restraints would tighten by fractions of a millimeter with each deviation. And if the heart rate continued to spike, sharp needles beneath the seat would begin to rise, slowly, rhythmically tapping the skin with cold, metallic warning. Edward wrote that he never used pain first. Pain was reserved for failure. He believed anticipation was the greater tool. He documented how children would begin to learn the pattern within hours, how the body would try to match the ticking sound instinctively, even when the mind resisted. One child, listed only as Subject 6, had allegedly learned to regulate his heartbeat to the rhythm for nearly 2 full hours before passing out from exhaustion. Edward called it a breakthrough. He recorded without emotion how the boy's breathing became shallower, his muscles locked, his eyes unblinking. He wrote, "He became time." One document, recovered from a file marked post-calibration observations, included notes on Subject 12. Unlike the others, she had not died in the chamber. She had survived, physically at least, transferred to a sanatorium after Edward deemed her complete. Her case file, found decades later, included crude sketches of a box mounted to a ceiling and words scrawled in childlike handwriting. "Don't think, just count." Nurses had reported strange behavior, flinching at the sound of watches, rocking slowly when the lights flickered, freezing whenever footsteps fell in consistent intervals. Even after decades in care, she avoided symmetrical sounds. Clocks were removed from the ward. She could not sleep in silence. She needed white noise, random and unpatterned. The smallest rhythm brought her back into the chair. Edward's notes suggested that he saw fear as an error, a malfunction of a poorly tuned inner rhythm. He believed that fear could be removed like rust, polished out with consistent pressure. The chair, the sounds, the punishments, all of it was a way to erase the human reflex and replace it with obedience that lived below choice. In one final entry he wrote, "When they obey not because they choose to, but because their bodies cannot do otherwise, I have succeeded." This wasn't controlled in the way most understood it. It wasn't dominance. It was engineering. He had removed morality from the equation entirely. Edward saw no evil in what he had done because he didn't believe there was a self to damage, only parts to align. He did not see the chamber as a tool of torment. He saw it as a tuning fork for the soul. The name Hour of Obedience was not about how long it lasted. It was about the moment the subject stopped fighting. That second when resistance died and the heartbeat fell in line with the tick. That moment to Edward was the proof of perfection. The investigators who stood in the chamber said nothing for nearly 15 minutes. Some could not stand to remain more than a few minutes. One man, a father of 3, asked to be reassigned and never returned. The sound of the ticking, faint, still running somehow despite the years, followed them out. Wallace had it recorded. He kept the recording locked in a file that was never made public. But he listened to it once, alone, and he understood something Edward never wrote down. It wasn't about fear, it wasn't even about pain. It was about control stripped so completely, so invisibly, that the victim didn't know they had lost it. That was the horror. Not that children had been broken, but some had been rebuilt, remade in rhythm, unable to scream, unable to even recognize what had been taken from them. And Edward, in his final notes, was proud. Proud that he had created silence so deep, so permanent, it lived inside the bodies he left behind. Outside the chamber, life continued. The clocks ticked in homes, the bells rang in schools. But deep below the estate, that chamber still sat. Its air heavy, its wires rusted, but its machine quiet. And yet, if you listened carefully enough, some claimed they could still hear the pulse. Still ticking, not from the walls, but from inside themselves. She had lived in silence for over 60 years, tucked away in a private wing of an asylum in Aberdeen. The staff called her Violet, though they admitted the name was guessed, taken from the color of the ribbon she wore around her wrist when she was admitted as a child. No records listed her family, no birth certificate, just a number stitched into her linen gown and a single word in the admission book: mute. It was a nurse who contacted Inspector Wallace after reading about the Drummond investigation in the papers. The nurse had seen one of the photographs, a page from Edward's journals marked Subject 12. Something about the drawing, the detail in the girl's eyes, had disturbed her. When Wallace arrived, he was not met with violence or fear. The woman sat quietly by the window, gray hair tied in braids, her hands folded over her lap like she'd been waiting. She did not flinch when he entered. She did not blink. She simply stared, not at Wallace, but past him. Like she was still in the room she had escaped. The doctors explained that she did not speak, not because of trauma, but because she physically could not. Her tongue had been removed with surgical precision. No signs of infection, no tearing, only clean scarring, as if it had been done by someone with experience in both anatomy and control. Wallace sat with her for hours, saying nothing. She said nothing back. But her hands moved. Slowly, carefully, she reached into a box by her chair and pulled out a stack of paper, hundreds of them stacked in neat rows. Drawings, not childish, but sharp, exact. Each one a memory she had never been allowed to say aloud. A long hallway with no windows, a chair surrounded by wires, a copper tube that hissed when the door closed, the silhouette of a man in a black coat, standing behind her with a metronome in his hand. One page showed a child sitting perfectly still while a pendulum swung beside his face. The next page showed the same child slumped, mouth open, eyes dark. Another showed the dinner table from the hollow room, but in her version the mannequins had faces, all of them crying, all of them watching. She had drawn herself too, alone in a cage of mirrors. Above her head, written in her own hand, were the words, "I obeyed." He smiled. Wallace tried to ask her questions, but she would only hand him more pages. Her trauma was recorded not in words, but in rhythm, the same rhythm Edward had forced upon her. Every line of every drawing was spaced with unnatural precision. Like her hand still moved to a time she couldn't escape. She was the only one who lived. The only one whose body did not give out, whose mind did not shatter completely. And yet, Wallace knew, what remained of her was not survival. It was programming. She had been broken into stillness, made into a vessel that could carry the memory forward without ever speaking it. In her silence, there was more horror than any scream he had ever heard, because she hadn't forgotten. She had been preserved. The attic had remained untouched for decades. A narrow door behind a tapestry, hidden at the end of a crooked hallway that curved away from the rest of the house like something trying to escape its own origin. The key was found inside a hollowed-out book beneath Edward's study floorboards, wrapped in cloth, stamped with the number 14. When Wallace turned the lock, the door resisted. Not jammed, not rusted, just heavy almost, like the air behind it had settled into a stillness too perfect to disturb. The space beyond was small, suffocating, yet every inch of it had been carefully arranged. It was not storage, it was not abandonment, it was curated. Lined along the far wall, beneath a thick layer of dust and silence, were 14 miniature wooden coffins, each carved by hand. The wood was smooth, stained, and sealed with brass hinges. Each one had a nameplate, but none bore the names of the children, only numbers, just as in the journals, subject 1, subject 2, subject 3, and on. Inside each coffin was a collection, not bones, not bodies, but relics. The kinds of things no one would give a second glance to unless they knew what they had cost. A pair of striped wool socks, still folded. A lock of hair tied with blue ribbon. 2 baby teeth. Tucked inside a velvet pouch. A drawing of a dog smiling crookedly in crayon. A metal thimble. A photograph of a hand bandaged at the wrist. Wallace moved slowly, unable to explain the weight pressing into his chest. Every coffin told a story, not of life, but of stopped life, of something carefully ended, then remembered in pieces as if to control how it would be mourned. And beside each coffin, pinned to the attic walls with brass nails, were pages of diagrams, pages taken from Edward's calibration journals, each one matching its coffin. There were maps of the body with red-inked pressure points, tables measuring how long it took for certain screams to begin and how long they lasted before silence, notes on pulse response, behavioral shifts, organ failure. These weren't trophies. They weren't even memories. They were records, blueprints of destruction. Edward had treated each death as a movement in a symphony, composed, executed, archived. He had rehearsed their suffering until it reached the moment he believed was perfect. Then he stopped time for them, not just in death, but in preservation. Wallace found one entry in the corner of the attic, written in smudged ink on yellowing paper. Only in stillness does truth remain. Noise fades, blood dries, but design is eternal. That sentence, more than anything else, captured the shape of Edward's mind. He did not see these children as victims. He saw them as compositions, arrangements of fear, obedience, and silence. He had built his own history, written not in dates, but in moments of final obedience. As Wallace stepped back into the hallway, his knees nearly gave out, not from horror alone, but from understanding. The attic was never meant to be found. It was meant to survive him. A private museum for a man who believed he had solved something no one else had even dared to ask. And now, the world had seen it. a gallery of cruelty that had been buried above their heads the entire time. The attic door was sealed again, not out of respect, but because once you see the archive, you can't unsee the method, and once you understand the method, you start to wonder what other houses have attics just like it. Waiting. They found him buried behind the estate, just beyond the edge of the property wall where the soil grew thin and the grass refused to grow. There was no headstone, no cross, no marker of any kind, just a shallow, stone-lined grave covered by a rusted grate. Wallace had the body exhumed not out of curiosity, but necessity. They needed to know how a man like Edward Drummond had ended, whether illness had claimed him, or if his own hand had brought silence to the ticking horrors he'd built. The coffin was unsealed beneath a gray morning sky. Inside lay Edward's corpse, preserved better than expected, almost too well. The skin had dried to parchment, clinging to bone, but his chest was strangely swollen, as if something had bloated within. When the mortician began the incision, there was resistance, not from rot or bone, but from metal. Beneath his sternum, carefully embedded and anchored between his ribs, was a small brass mechanism. A wind-up device, complete with a key slot and polished gears wrapped in a web of sinew and thread. It was not resting beside his heart. It had replaced it. The heart had been removed entirely, and in its place was this machine, hand-forged and stitched directly into the cavity. It didn't tick anymore, but there were signs it once had. Faint grooves worn into the ribcage, friction marks against the tissue. Metal had been made to live inside him. Wallace stood in stunned silence. This wasn't just madness. This was a transformation. Edward had not only tried to shape the rhythm of others, he had tried to become a machine himself, to erase the last trace of human unpredictability. No more hunger, no more fear, no more deviation from the beat. His journals hinted at it, but never said it aloud. Diagrams sketched in the margins, notes about unified rhythm and bodily replacement. It had always sounded like theory, grotesque metaphor, but now it is a fact. Edward Drummond had turned his body into a vessel for time itself. Not a symbolic time, mechanical time, controlled, measured, wound by hand. Wallace looked at the body and felt no relief, no closure. Only dread. Because Edward had succeeded, he had erased the one thing that made him human. And the deeper question lingered, unspoken. Had he built others? Has someone else already taken up the key? And somewhere, even now, was something still ticking. The fire that consumed the Drummond estate burned for 3 nights. Locals said it sounded like the house was screaming. Windows burst in the darkness. Flames clawed through the tower, and the soot could be seen drifting all the way to the coast by morning. By the time the fire brigade arrived, there was nothing left to save, and quietly no one had really tried. The villagers of Dunbray stood on the edges of their fields and watched the inferno with something that resembled grief. But not for the building, not for the family name. They mourned something else entirely. Something they hadn't dared name for 50 years. The guilt, the failure, the long silence they had wrapped around Edward Drummond while children vanished through his doors. When news of the case broke beyond the village, when the full extent of Edward's cruelty was revealed, Scotland did not react with the disbelief many expected. It reacted with rage, cold, deep, generational rage. Because this was not simply a story about one man. It was about a system that allowed him to exist. A society that favored reputation over suspicion, process over protection, appearances over instinct. Overnight, the name Edward Drummond became a national stain. Not because of what he did in secret, but because of how openly he had been trusted. Parents wept for children who were never theirs. Teachers searched records for students who disappeared between terms. Churches opened donation ledgers to find Edward's name. There it was, always neatly written, always accompanied by a note about supporting the disadvantaged. People who had once shaken his hand found themselves unable to sleep. Journalists came in droves, hoping for stories. But what they uncovered was not a simple tale of evil. It was layers of neglect built brick by brick across decades. Orphanage files, long buried in dust and mold, were pulled from basements and reviewed line by line. Transfers that had never been followed up, inspections that were never done. Letters from frightened caretakers who raised concerns, only to be silenced by administrators more concerned with Edward's donations than his intentions. Under mounting public pressure, a national inquiry was launched. It became the largest child protection investigation Scotland had ever seen. Testimonies poured in, from nurses, social workers, and even retired priests. Each story painted the same picture. Edward was too quiet to question, too polite to doubt. And when he took in another child, people thanked him. They called him generous. In doing so, they passed the burden along, letting one man become the keeper of lives no one wanted to hold. As the investigation widened, similar patterns emerged across the country. Other institutions were implicated, not in the same scale of horror, but in the same sin of silence. Forgotten boys, buried complaints, faded photos of children who never grew up. Edward's crimes had opened something larger than his attic. It had opened the vault of collective denial, and what spilled out couldn't be undone. The government acted quickly, but nothing they passed could erase the years that had already been lost. Laws were rewritten to ensure that no private citizen could adopt without full government approval. Background checks became standard, not optional. New frameworks were introduced in orphanages to flag unusual patterns of removal or visitations. Hospitals began tracking the emotional development of transferred children, no longer assuming that stillness meant safety. And perhaps most importantly, asylum records were finally opened. What emerged from those records chilled the country again. Dozens and maybe hundreds of children had been institutionalized in the early to mid-20th century under vague diagnoses like intractable, unresponsive, or disobedient. Many of them had no known family, no clear past, and a disturbing number had passed through privately funded programs linked to benefactors who were never questioned. Their names blurred together in files. Their conditions were labeled, but their stories weren't told. Until now, in Aberdeen, a ward nurse uncovered a file that had been misfiled for decades. Inside was a black and white photo of a girl with her mouth sewn shut. Her case had been closed in 1932. She had never spoken again. The nurse wept, not because she had failed the girl, she had never known her, but because the system had. And systems, unlike people, don't weep. They don't remember. They don't mourn. They move on, unless forced to stop. Memorials began to appear, first small, then widespread. Not statues of Edward, not plaques of forgiveness, but stones. Simple flat stones etched with numbers. The same numbers Edward had used to strip his victims of names. These were placed at schools, hospitals, courthouses. A quiet rebellion against forgetting. The largest stood where the estate once loomed, its tower long since collapsed. The people of Dunbray came together, many for the first time in years, to witness its placement. It was shaped like a clock, shattered at the center, its hands frozen forever at midnight. Around it, 14 markers circled outward, each bearing a single number and the words "taken," not forgotten. The ceremony was short, no speeches, just silence. But it was not the same silence that had protected Edward. This was a silence of weight, of reckoning, a silence that dared people to remember, to pay attention, to ask the question they had avoided for generations. What did we miss? The most lasting change came not from law, but from awareness. Children were taught the story in schools, not as a cautionary tale, but as a history. Teachers were trained to listen differently, to look closer, to understand that discipline, when wrapped in calmness and order, can still be cruel. That abuse does not always scream. Sometimes it clicks. Sometimes it obeys. And yet not everything could be repaired. Some scars became silence in new forms. Survivors whose voices were never heard faded quietly from public life. Some refused interviews. Others asked that their names be kept hidden. They had lived through the pattern, and the attention, even the well-meaning kind, felt like another kind of inspection. One woman, believed to be Subject 12, remained in care until her death at 81. She never spoke a word, but her drawings continued, page after page, each one dated, each one drawn with lines spaced so evenly it felt mechanical. Her final image was simple. A broken metronome stopped mid-swing. No caption, no face, just stillness. Edward Drummond's name was officially removed from every registry of national recognition. His family's legacy was stripped from historical societies, museums, and even horological archives. His clocks, once prized possessions, were taken down, melted, or sealed in evidence. But the story, his story, did not vanish. It became something else. A wound carried forward. A reminder that what is hidden behind routine, behind politeness, behind the illusion of control, can be monstrous. In the end, Edward didn't leave behind children. He didn't leave behind apprentices or friends or family. He left behind a question that would echo in every institution for decades to come. How many more were there? Because Edward Drummond wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a demon. He was a man with a method. And men with methods often teach others, not directly, but in the shadow they cast, in the ideas they leave behind, in the systems that allowed them to rise and kept them from falling. So now, whenever a new law is proposed to restrict oversight, or a background check is delayed, or a complaint is dismissed because someone seems too kind, too clean, or too organized, someone inevitably says his name. Not as a curse, but as a warning, as a reminder of what silence creates, because laws can change. But memory is something we have to keep choosing, over and over again, in every school, in every courtroom, in every quiet room where someone has too much power and too few eyes watching. Edward Drummond may be gone, but time, as he once believed, doesn't forget. It just waits. And so must we. In the years that followed the uncovering of the Drummond estate's horrors, much was written by journalists, historians, psychologists, each attempting to give shape to the man who had caused it all. Some called Edward Drummond a sadist. Others labeled him a genius warped by grief. A few even entertained the idea that he had been possessed, as if trying to excuse what had no place in human understanding. But those who studied his writings closely, those who read every numbered page, measured every entry, and walked through every preserved room, came to a different conclusion, one that sat heavier than any supernatural theory. Edward was not out of control. He was not deranged. He was deliberate. What made him terrifying was not that he acted on chaos, but that he worked through order. His evil was not passionate. It was patient, measured, structured. Like the clocks he built, Edward's mind ticked with intention. He did not see cruelty as violence. He saw it as a correction. He believed in a world of disorder, of flawed impulses, and he took it upon himself to fix what he viewed as broken. Not through empathy, not through healing, but through method, a brutal, quiet, systematic method. He made charts of children's behavior the same way someone might chart the movement of stars. He believed the human spirit, the soul itself, could be recalibrated if its natural rhythm was stripped away and rebuilt, second by second. He believed that obedience was not taught through love, but through design. In his journals, there are no expressions of guilt, no questions, no cracks in the armor, just data, just adjustments. Just cold observations of how long it took for a child to stop resisting when subjected to a specific frequency of sound, or how quickly panic would settle into stillness if hunger was paired with mechanical repetition. He didn't see children. He saw unformed machines, raw material waiting to be shaped. When one child failed to meet his standard, he didn't mourn. He was replaced. And when one method stopped working, he did not retreat. He redesigned it. That was what defined him most. The refusal to stop. Edward lived among his victims without ever seeming dangerous. He dressed well, paid his taxes, nodded politely to those he passed in town. He spoke softly. He gave. He contributed. And in doing so, he reminded the world of an ancient truth, that evil does not always wear a monster's face. More often, it wears the face of a neighbor, a teacher, a craftsman, someone who never raises their voice, never causes a scene. Someone who understands that the most effective kind of harm is the kind that can be hidden behind words like structure, discipline, and improvement. What makes such evil so dangerous is that it is not recognized until it is too late. It's the kind of evil that thrives in systems, in unchecked power, in quiet rooms, in trusting communities that look away. Because what they see on the outside is simply too neat to challenge. After the public learned the full truth, a question began to rise, not just in Scotland, but across institutions around the world. How many other Edward Drummonds had existed, not as dramatic monsters, but as men who operated within walls of silence and admiration? Men who were never stopped because no one ever thought to question the calm ones. No one wants to imagine that the person who smiles kindly at a child might also study their breath patterns in the dark. But that, in the end, is what Edward relied on. Not just silence, but trust. And he weaponized that trust into something colder than violence, into ritual, into repetition. Into a kind of evil that left no blood at first glance, only patterns. One investigator called him a man who turned suffering into architecture. Another said that his home wasn't just a crime scene. It was a temple built to control, a place where every floorboard, every nail, every echo was tuned to erase resistance. Even now, after everything had been burned or buried, many believed that something remained in the ruins. Not in the form of ghosts or spirits, but in the tension left behind. Visitors to the site speak of a stillness they can't explain, not peace, but pressure, as if the silence isn't empty but holding something back, something timed, something rehearsed. And perhaps it is because Edward's legacy was not just in what he built, but in what he proved, that cruelty doesn't require rage, it only needs purpose. That silence, when shaped carefully enough, can make people disappear. Not just physically, but historically. 14 children were taken, 14 stories removed from the world almost without a trace, and yet it took 50 years for the truth to crawl out from beneath the floorboards. 50 years before someone asked where those boys had gone. 50 years of everyone looking at Edward and seeing nothing but a gentleman, a clockmaker, a man who kept to himself. That is the price of silence. That is how evil survives. Not by hiding, but by behaving. Wallace Murray never returned to police work. After the final report, he left the force and never spoke publicly again. But in a letter written years later and left unopened until after his death, he left a warning. He wrote that the scariest part of the Drummond case wasn't what was done. It was how close it came to being forgotten. How quickly the world wanted to explain it, wrap it in madness, and move on. But he believed Edward wasn't sick, he was possible. A type of mind born not out of chaos but out of structure, quiet and logic. Wallace feared that as long as society measured goodness by appearance, politeness, and routine, men like Edward would always find a way in. The silence between seconds. That was how Wallace described the feeling. The pause between events, the spaces where nothing seems wrong, where no screams are heard, no blood is seen, and yet something is already breaking. It's in the way a child flinches before sound. It's in the way no one asks why someone has keys to places they shouldn't. It's in the way the world forgives coldness if it comes with discipline. These moments are quiet. Easy to miss, but that is where the worst things grow, not in the chaos, but in the calm between. So now, with the story finally told, we are left with a question. Not about Edward, we know what he was. The question is about us. What do we do with silence? When someone stops crying, do we see it as strength or surrender? When a child obeys too quickly, do we call it respect or programming? And when someone speaks with calm, calculated words, do we hear wisdom or do we feel the gears turning behind their eyes? Because the truth is, evil does not always scream. It ticks, softly, quietly, waiting. In the space between what we see and what we choose not to, in the silence between seconds. What do you think? Could this happen again? Or has it already?